Welcome to Allegedly True, the show where the news is real, the suffering is documented, and the comedy is the only thing keeping any of us from lying face down on the floor until someone finds us in 3 to 5 business days. We begin tonight where all great journalistic investigations begin, with a sister absolutely obliterating her brother in a BBC documentary. A Hollywood actor, apparently dissatisfied with the moderate fame and steady income of being a Hollywood actor, decided to rebrand himself as a Manosphere messiah by copying Andrew Tate's entire playbook, a sentence that contains 4 separate reasons to stare at the ceiling and question your choices. His sister came forward to explain that he essentially watched a man who is currently facing criminal charges in multiple countries and thought, yes, that is the blueprint I want for my life. The BBC called it an investigation into the rise of misogynistic content, which is a very polite way of saying they watched a man cosplay as a worse version of a person who is already the worst version of a person. What truly elevates this story is that he left Hollywood, a place where people routinely pretend to be heroes for money, to become an online prophet for men who feel that women are the reason their life hasn't worked out, which is the same as leaving a bakery because you're hungry. Next, the BBC won an Emmy Award for its coverage of the Myanmar earthquake, which is a genuine achievement and a genuinely complicated thing to be cheerful about. The BBC covered a devastating earthquake in one of the most brutalized nations on earth, where a military junta has been systematically destroying its own population for years, and the reward for doing that well is a trophy at an event in New York. We are not saying the Emmy isn't deserved. We are saying that the sentence BBC News wins Emmy for earthquake coverage is doing a lot of emotional labor for a Tuesday. The journalists who reported from the ground risked real things to document real catastrophe, and they were recognized at a gala where people ate salmon and applauded, which is precisely how civilization processes tragedy when it's functioning normally. Moving on to a story that is somehow both boring and enraging, the European Commission has fined Temu €200 million for allowing the sale of illegal products, specifically baby toys and faulty chargers. Temu, for those who have somehow avoided it, is the online marketplace that operates on the business model of sending you 17 items you didn't order and 1 item you did, all of which arrive in separate packages over a 3-week period, each one with slightly more alarming customs paperwork than the last. The EU said Temu failed to account for the risks from dangerous products sold on its platform, and Temu responded in the way all large companies respond to regulatory fines, which is to say they probably already had this budgeted. €200 million sounds like a punishment until you remember that Temu's parent company is worth more than the GDP of several countries that have actual governments. The fine is the corporate equivalent of telling someone they've been a bit naughty and watching them nod and continue. Now we arrive at Married at First Sight UK, a show whose entire premise is that strangers should get married before meeting, which even in the best possible reading of human psychology sounds like something designed by someone who has never met a person. BBC insiders have described the show's culture as toxic, which follows recent reports that 2 women told the BBC they had been raped while participating in the programme. The producers are described as having an unhealthy focus on sex, which in context is not a quirky note about editorial priorities but an active and serious allegation about how vulnerable people were treated by a production that profits from manufacturing intimacy under controlled conditions. Channel 4 has not cancelled the show. Channel 4 has, however, announced a welfare review, which is what you do when you want to use the word welfare without actually changing anything, because the show's ratings are currently doing better than the show's conscience. In medical news designed to make every man over 40 stare directly into the middle distance, UK health advisors have announced that prostate cancer screening should only be offered to, and this is a quote, a few thousand high-risk men. The reasoning is that widespread screening produces too many false positives and leads to unnecessary treatment, which is a medically defensible position that will nonetheless be received by approximately 14 million men as the NHS telling them their prostate is not worth the paperwork. The advisors specified that only men with a dangerous genetic variant and a family history of cancer qualify, which means the criteria for finding out you might have cancer is already having evidence that you might have cancer, a logic structure so circular it could be used as a roundabout. The good news is that if you don't have the genetic variant, you probably don't need screening. The bad news is that you won't know you have the genetic variant unless someone screens you for it, a puzzle that scientists are apparently fine leaving on the table. Your £5 coffee would like a word. Coffees at some city centre outlets now cost £5, a development that has united the British public in the way that only the price of something you could make at home for 20 pence truly can. The BBC has helpfully explained that this is a story of tariffs, climate change, Gen Z cultural tastes, and what they describe as savvy coffee farmers playing the market, which is the most gently optimistic framing of global economic collapse available in the English language. The climate is destroying coffee-growing regions. Tariffs are restructuring supply chains. And young people have decided that a coffee is not just a beverage but an experience, a ritual, a small luxury that signals something about who you are. And in this they are correct, because what a £5 coffee signals is that you have £5 and nowhere better to put it. The savvy farmers are the heroes of this story and deserve every penny, which after the supply chain, the roaster, the distributor, the barista, and the oat milk surcharge, amounts to approximately 4 pence. There are two sets of headlines this week about the same event, which is the murder of Henry Novak, a first-year university student killed with a ceremonial knife while walking home from a night out in Southampton. The BBC and Sky News both covered the verdict, with Sky News taking care to specify that the weapon was a 21cm Sikh kirpan. This detail has been included in several headlines with a prominence that will not be lost on anyone who has watched the news cycle process violence through the lens of which community the weapon belongs to. A young man is dead. Another young man will go to prison. Henry Novak was 19 years old, studying, going out, living the first months of what was supposed to be an expanding life, and he was killed by a stranger on a dark street, and the thing most headline writers wanted you to know is what religion the knife was associated with. The correct response to this is to notice it and then sit with the discomfort of noticing it. In news that sounds like it was written by someone who wanted to see if the BBC's editorial system had any safeguards, thousands of people in Kent are without tap water because of a heatwave that has also killed at least 10 people who went into open water to cool down. The country is experiencing record temperatures. The reservoirs are at critical level. A teenage boy is the 10th person to die swimming outdoors in weather that the government has not declared a national emergency over, because declaring a national emergency over heat in Britain would require admitting that Britain has heat, which is constitutionally awkward. 60 homes in a Scottish village have also been evacuated after the ground started moving, which is a sentence that should frighten you but lands in this news cycle somewhere below the coffee prices on the National Concern Index. Britain is currently rationing water while people die in ponds while the ground moves in Scotland, while someone in a city centre is paying £5 for a flat white, and the BBC has won an Emmy, and the show Married at First Sight is still being commissioned. In other international stability news, Iran has struck an American base following fresh US strikes, during what negotiators are describing as a fragile ceasefire, a phrase that is doing the same work as calling a house fire a fragile moment of domestic warmth. The US and Iran have been at war for 3 months, conducting strikes and counterstrikes and then announcing ceasefires and then conducting more strikes, which is what diplomacy looks like when both parties agree that diplomacy is what they're doing while disagreeing about whether bombing counts. Meanwhile, Israel struck Beirut in what it described as a targeted strike, Beirut being a city that had until this week largely been spared, a distinction that the residents of Beirut had been hoping would continue for longer than it did. Hezbollah and Israel have accused each other of breaking last month's ceasefire, which is the geopolitical version of two people arguing about who started it while the kitchen is on fire, and the international community's role in this metaphor is to stand in the doorway and say that all parties should exercise restraint. We close this week with two final stories that belong together for reasons that are not pleasant to articulate. A former supply teacher has admitted to taking more than 100 upskirt photographs of pupils. A 15-year-old boy has been charged with 2 rapes and other sexual offenses against 10 girls. These stories sit at opposite ends of the perpetrator age spectrum and at exactly the same coordinates on the map of institutional failure, because in one case a school employed someone long enough for him to photograph over 100 children, and in the other case a child committed serious sexual offenses against 10 other children, and both of these things happened in environments that are supposed to be safe, governed, supervised, and protective. There is no joke here. There is only the observation that we cover these stories every week, and then we move on to the next week, and they keep happening, and the word that describes the distance between how often we are shocked and how often we actually change anything is not a word that comedy can close. That is your week. The BBC won an Emmy. The coffee is £5. The ceasefire is fragile. And somewhere in a Kent village, a person is paying £5 for a coffee with water that doesn't exist, while the ground moves in Scotland, and a Hollywood messiah checks his subscribe account. We will be back next week with more, because more will have happened. It always does.